Around 9:30 a.m. on June 16, 2010, a 29-year-old woman named Linnell Barsock lay in bed in her house in Palmdale, California. It was a Wednesday, and Linnell had the day off from her job at a health center in Los Angeles. But she didn't really have time to relax, because she was also a college student. She was working on becoming a registered nurse, and she knew she had to get up and go study. But she just didn't feel like it. Plus, she could hear her boyfriend Lewis moving around in the kitchen downstairs, and just knowing Lewis was down there was another reason to stay put. So Linnell and Lewis had been together for about 4 years. They'd met in college and immediately hit it off. Now, they own this house together, a 5-bedroom home that they had scraped together all their savings to make a down payment on. At the beginning of their relationship, Linnell and Lewis had been completely in love and on the same page about building a life together. But over time, Lewis had become this incredibly jealous and possessive person that was just really volatile, and it really just kind of scared Linnell and was beginning to drive her away. And then, just a few months ago, they'd gotten into this huge screaming fight when he had heard her talking to another guy on the phone. That fight had gotten so bad that she had tried to drive away, but Lewis had literally chased her in his truck, which led to both of them crashing. Even now, as she laid in bed months later, Linnell still felt traumatized by that whole thing. They had eventually made up, but it was hard to look at Lewis in the same way. It was like she couldn't see a future with him anymore. All she saw now was this volatile, controlling guy. And so lately, Linnell was seriously considering ending things with him. But just then, Linnell's phone buzzed on the nightstand, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her friend Lorraine asking if she was up. And as soon as she saw it, Linnell just kind of sighed because she actually had forgotten that she had plans with Lorraine, who had offered to do Linnell's hair that day. So, resigned, she texted Lorraine to come on over. Then Linnell got out of bed. About 30 minutes later, Linnell sat on a bar stool and ate breakfast at the kitchen island with Lewis. The stools were actually some of the only furniture in the whole house. It had already been a year since they'd moved in, but Linnell so far had not had time to decorate. As she ate, Linnell tried to keep her chit-chat with Lewis to a minimum. They'd been fighting so much lately that she didn't want to accidentally start an argument. But Linnell was a naturally bubbly and talkative person, and so just sitting here being quiet was kind of awkward. So she was actually relieved when she heard the front door open and her friend Lorraine walked in. Linnell smiled. Lorraine lived right in Palmdale, and so it was nice for Linnell to have a friend so close by. The rest of Linnell's friends and family were in LA, about an hour and a half away. Lorraine walked over and gave Linnell a hug, and the two of them began talking while Lewis got ready to leave. He was going to have his truck worked on actually by Lorraine's boyfriend, who lived near LA and would do the work for a low price. It was a long drive, but it was worth it for the savings. Lewis ultimately left without even saying goodbye, and then at that point, Lorraine worked on Linnell's hair while Linnell vented about Lewis and how tense things had gotten. And just talking about everything actually made her feel better, even though she had no idea how she was actually going to solve any of these big problems in her relationship. But about an hour later, Linnell suddenly heard tires screech into the driveway outside. Seconds later, Lewis burst into the house looking absolutely furious. He was holding a cell phone above his head and waving it around in the air. And Linnell immediately recognized this phone, because it was her secret phone that she'd actually gotten from her other boyfriend. That guy she'd been talking to on the phone with the day she and Lewis got in that big fight about it that ended with the car crash. Well, the truth was, Lewis had a reason to be upset because she was talking to another guy who she was involved with. It was this other boyfriend. That other boyfriend's name was Ike, and Linnell had met him about 4 months ago on a dating website. Both of them were seeking careers in nursing, and they had a ton in common. Ike was also way calmer, more successful, and more motivated than Lewis. He lived over 300 miles away in Northern California, but whenever he had time off and Lewis wasn't home, he came down to Palmdale to see Linnell. On the day of Linnell and Lewis's huge fight, Linnell had promised Lewis that she would never talk to Ike again. But that had been a lie, and now Lewis had caught her. And so Lewis started yelling, demanding to know if Linnell was still cheating on him, and Linnell felt her heart start racing. The last time Lewis had gotten like this, their fight ended with a literal car crash. She didn't want that to happen again, so she decided the best way to handle this was to just remove herself from this situation. So she just walked over and grabbed the secret phone out of Lewis's hand and then ran out the door with Lorraine while Lewis kept on screaming at her. Linnell and Lorraine jumped into Linnell's car and sped out of the neighborhood. Linnell couldn't stop shaking because she knew Lewis was furious and she didn't really know what was going to happen next. And so she and Lorraine decided that they would just go kill some time by going to a beauty store to get some more products, and hopefully by the time they got home, Lewis would be gone. The two of them got to the store around noon. Linnell and Lorraine went inside, and Linnell walked around the aisles, grabbing products. Her heart was still hammering in her chest, and when she checked out at the counter, she found herself just staring into space, trying her best to, not think about Lewis, but she couldn't help herself. But by the time she actually had her products paid for and put in a bag, she was starting to calm down just a little bit. Then she headed outside with Lorraine. However, as soon as she stepped out of the shop, she gasped, because right there on the sidewalk was Lewis. He was waiting for her. Lewis demanded to know if she was still seeing Ike, and at first, Linnell was just super defensive, like she always was when they fought. But as Lewis continued to rant and accuse her, her head just started to pound, and then suddenly, it was like all of her fear and stress about this relationship just disappeared. This weird sense of calm came over her, and she knew this was it. This was the last straw. She was done, and she just wanted Lewis out of her life. So she exhaled, handed Lewis her second phone, and then just stormed back over to the car with Lorraine. About 15 minutes later, Linnell parked her car in the driveway at home. When she'd gotten into her car and driven away, she'd thought that maybe she had lost Lewis, and she'd hoped that he had just driven somewhere far away to cool down. But apparently, that hadn't happened, because his truck was parked right outside the house, which meant Lewis was inside, waiting for her. Linnell wanted to scream. She glanced at Lorraine, who just reached over and squeezed her hand, trying to give her a bit of encouragement. Then Linnell just took a deep breath. She knew what she was doing with Ike was wrong, but she was sick of all the fights and of Lewis trying to control everything about her. I mean, the relationship had died months ago. She just needed to end it now, officially. She wished she had more time to plan out how to do this, but after today, she felt like she had no choice. She just had to go in there and tell him this was done. So Linnell got out of her car and headed towards the house. Over 6 hours later, around 6:45 p.m., Linnell's friend Lorraine was staring down at her silent cell phone and starting to feel nervous. Linnell hadn't called her after whatever final fight she had had with Lewis, and Lorraine had a bad feeling about the whole thing. She knew that Lewis and Linnell's fights had the possibility of getting completely out of hand. I mean, they had before. So now, Lorraine was back at Linnell's house, just making sure her friend was okay. But as she walked through the living room, she noticed their house was unnaturally quiet. Lewis was not there, and it didn't seem like Linnell was there either. That morning, Lorraine had been afraid, when Lewis was chasing them all around town, and now she was starting to get that same nervous sense that maybe Lewis was nearby, about to spring out at her. But she told herself to just settle down and focus. However, when she passed by the laundry room, she felt this wave of panic so intense come over her that she had to grasp the wall just to steady herself. Because there, on the laundry room floor, was a pile of bloody towels. And then beyond the laundry room, there was a door that led into the garage, and it was partially open. And so Lorraine was very nervous, but still, she felt like she had to investigate, and so she walked over to the door and she pushed it all the way open. Now, it was dark in the garage, so she couldn't see much, and so she just stepped forward, and when she did, she stepped onto this plastic bag that was slick, and it caused her to trip and fall to the ground. And then when she looked at what she had fallen in, she realized it was blood. She stood up as quick as she could and then just stood there staring at the garage like waiting for movement, but there was no one in there. And then as her eyes slowly adjusted, she saw Linnell's car. It had been backed into the garage and was now sitting there with its trunk open, and when she looked at the ground by its back wheels, she saw something sticking out from behind the car. And the longer she stared at it, the more the image clarified. It was a pair of feet. At this point, Lorraine turned and ran. A few minutes later, Lorraine sped into the parking lot at the Palmdale Sheriff's Department. Once she parked, she stumbled out of her car and began running towards the front doors. Once she got inside, she charged up to the employee at the front desk and just started yelling about how there was blood, so much blood, and how she had slipped in it when she tried to find her friend, and her friend was just lying there, and she knew she wasn't making a lot of sense, but it was like it was impossible to think. Finally, though, she was able to calm down enough that she just blurted out, "My friend Linnell was murdered." Later that night, around 11 p.m., two homicide detectives stood in the driveway of Linnell's home, looking up at the two-story house. Their names were Bob Kenny and Joe Espino, and they were veteran detectives who worked together all the time. They'd come all the way from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Homicide Bureau, which meant they'd just driven about an hour and a half to get to Palmdale. But this actually wasn't out of the ordinary. Detective Kenny had been called to Palmdale more than a few times to investigate homicides there. Palmdale had gotten safer in recent years, but the murder rate was still higher than both the state and the national average. But as Kenny looked at his surroundings, this trip to Palmdale felt different. They were in an upscale neighborhood, and the house they were standing in front of looked nice. The detectives walked inside, and right away, Kenny noticed that the front door was undamaged, and a uniformed police officer who was standing in the entryway told them that there were no signs of forced entry at the back door either. Kenny had already been briefed that this home was owned by a 29-year-old woman named Linnell Barsock, who was found dead in her garage by a friend right after what sounded like a pretty intense fight with her boyfriend. Linnell shared the home with that boyfriend, Louis Bonaire, and Louis was nowhere to be found. So to Kenny, this was starting to look like a pretty straightforward case. Romantic partners, especially angry ones, were always the first suspects, and the fact that Louis had apparently taken off made him look even more suspicious. There were already officers out canvassing the neighborhood and calling Louis's friends and family, trying to track him down. The uniformed officer led Kenny and Espino through the house towards the garage. As they walked, Kenny noted the strange emptiness of all the rooms. Some didn't even have furniture in them. But this didn't feel like robbers had come in and removed all the furniture. It just sort of seemed like the house was vacant. And on top of that, there really were no signs of robbery in general. I mean, the TV was there and nothing had been rifled through, but Kenny was more struck by the fact that there was so little to steal in the first place. To get to the garage, the detectives had to pass through a laundry room, and when he stepped inside that area, Detective Kenny saw bloody towels everywhere and smears of blood on the floor. It was immediately obvious that whoever had killed Linnell had tried, and failed, to clean up their mess. When Kenny and Espino stepped into the garage, they found there was a car there that had been backed in and had its trunk open. Next to it on the ground were more bloody towels, along with large plastic sheets, and most of them were shoved to the side and in a big pile. But there was some bloody plastic sheeting that was up by the door to the laundry room where they were standing. Detective Kenny stepped into the garage around the bloody towels to the far side of the car, where he saw a pair of feet on the floor. It was Linnell. Her face was covered by a black plastic bag, and so Detective Kenny knelt down and peeled back the plastic. He found her face and head were covered in blood, and when he tipped her head to the side, he saw the source, a bullet hole right in the back of her skull. He wondered if the killer had wrapped her head in plastic to try to, clean up or contain the blood, or if they had felt some kind of remorse and couldn't bear to look at Linnell's face. Detective Kenny stood and moved over to the trunk of the car. When he looked inside, he saw that it was full of garbage bags, which were packed with bloody sheets and bedding. It looked like the killer must have been trying to put all this evidence into the car and drive away with it, except they hadn't actually done that. Instead, they left the car behind, along with everything else, which just didn't make any sense. Kenny wondered if maybe something like, the arrival of Linnell's friend, Lorraine, had interrupted the killer before they could escape. But just then, a deputy stuck his head in the garage and excitedly told the detectives that they'd just found something. Moments later, Detectives Kenny and Espino were standing in the kitchen. They were leaning over a piece of paper that lay on the floor, right beside a yellow evidence marker the crime scene techs had placed. This piece of paper had messy handwriting on it. Kenny made sure it was photographed before he picked it up with his gloved hand to look closer. It was a letter, signed by Linnell and addressed to Louis, her boyfriend. The letter said she was leaving him for her other boyfriend, Ike. At this, Kenny raised his eyebrows. The missing boyfriend, Louis, was already suspect number one, and this note certainly gave him a motive for murder. But it also gave Kenny a second suspect, this other boyfriend, Ike. Maybe, he thought, this case was going to be more complicated than he first expected. He looked around at the bare kitchen and the empty rooms beyond it, and it looked to him like neither of the people living in the house had actually committed to settling in and staying together. Linnell apparently had one foot out the door already. As he read the note one more time, Kenny wondered what other secrets his victim might have been keeping. Detectives Kenny and Espino were still on scene when a uniformed officer came to tell them that they had gotten a lead on the missing boyfriend, Lewis. Apparently, he had gone to Los Angeles, and he often stayed at Linnell's mom's house when he was there, since the drive back to Palmdale was so long. It was the middle of the night by this point, but that didn't matter. Kenny dispatched an LA police officer to wait outside of Linnell's mother's house as backup, and then he dialed the phone number for Linnell's mom. After a few rings, a woman answered. When Detective Kenny introduced himself, she confirmed she was Linnell's mother, Bobby Barsock. She sounded concerned and asked what was going on, but Kenny didn't tell her. Instead, he needed to speak to Lewis. His decision not to explain himself was strategic. Neither Bobby nor Lewis had been told explicitly that Linnell was dead, and Detective Kenny wanted to hold back that information for as long as possible. When he talked to Lewis, he wanted to see if Lewis would act confused, which would be the natural reaction if you really hadn't done anything, or if he would behave like a guilty person who knew exactly why the police were calling him in the middle of the night. Detective Kenny heard Bobby hand over the phone, and then a man came on the line and said he was Lewis. And right away, Lewis said, "This is about Linnell." When Kenny finished the phone call a few minutes later, he was feeling good, because now he had a definite number one suspect. Lewis had brought up Linnell without being told she was dead, and then he had been surprisingly cooperative when Kenny responded by giving him no information at all and just told him to go outside and get into the squad car in front of the house that's waiting for him. To Kenny, it seemed like Lewis had been waiting for this call, and maybe even feeling guilty. He thought of the plastic that had been pulled over Linnell's face, like whoever had killed her couldn't bear to look at what they had done. After Kenny had told Lewis over the phone to go get into the squad car, he had spoken to Linnell's mom, Bobby Barsock, again. And when he told her that her daughter was dead, Bobby just wailed in anguish into the phone. And then eventually, she told Kenny how controlling and jealous Lewis was, and she said she was coming to the sheriff's department to talk to them too. It would take more than an hour and a half for Lewis and Bobby to get to Palmdale, but that was fine by Kenny. He and his partner still needed to go talk to their first eyewitness, the friend, Lorraine, who had reported the murder in the first place, who was waiting for them at the sheriff's department. Around 6 a.m., Detectives Kenny and Espino walked through the same sheriff's department doors that Lorraine had burst through 11 hours earlier, saying that she had found her friend dead. Lorraine had already told her story to uniformed officers, but Kenny wanted to hear her story directly. He had read her statement, and it was clear that she had been in a state of pure panic when she had first arrived at the department. When Kenny and his partner walked into the interview room and sat down across from Lorraine, Kenny thought she seemed a lot calmer than her statement made her out to be, although she did still have blood on her clothes and looked exhausted and clearly shaken up. He started slowly, with general questions about her relationship to Linnell. Lorraine said they were really good friends, and they hung out a few times a week since they lived so close to each other. Then she went over what had happened the day before, how she'd gone to Linnell's that morning to do her hair, but then Linnell and Lewis had gotten into a big fight, and Lewis, had ended up chasing them all around town. Lorraine said that she and Linnell had gone back to Linnell's house at about 12:30 p.m., and Lewis was there waiting for them. She said that she decided to leave and give the couple some space. Lorraine said the couple's fighting was typical, and that whole relationship honestly was toxic. But this fight in particular did seem worse, because Linnell was cheating on Lewis with a man named Ike, and Lewis had found out about it. Kenny and Espino looked at each other. This information lined up exactly with that letter they had found at the scene. Lorraine said after she had left Linnell's, she had gone to a nearby park, and there she just waited to hear from Linnell. But by early evening, she still had not heard, and she was starting to get worried. So around 6:45 p.m., she went back to Linnell's to make sure her friend was okay, and that's when she found Linnell's body. As Lorraine told this part of the story, her calm affect changed and she became much more emotional. Lorraine looked down at her stained clothes and just began to cry. Detective Kenny pushed a box of tissues across the table. He felt for Lorraine because no matter what, it was a trauma she would carry for the rest of her life to have found her friend dead. But there was one thing about her story that just kind of didn't sit right, and that was Lorraine's claim that she had been sitting in the park for 5 hours, just waiting for her friend to call her back or text her. Kenny wasn't sure he believed that. It had been very hot out all day, almost 90 degrees, and that whole time, Lorraine is just sitting on a bench, people watching, waiting for Linnell the whole time? It just seemed sort of unrealistic. But that was her story, and she hadn't changed it once. And anyways, the crime itself did really seem like textbook domestic violence, and Linnell's boyfriend Lewis was acting like a man with a very guilty conscience. But regardless, at this point, it was obvious to Kenny that Lorraine was no longer in any condition to answer any more questions, so they would just have to talk to her again later. And so he and Detective Espino told Lorraine she could go. And then, when the detectives stepped out of the interview room, an officer was waiting for them. The boyfriend, Louis Bonaire, had arrived. Now, Louis still had not been told what happened to Linnell, like he didn't know she was dead. And suspiciously, he had not asked anybody why he had been summoned to the sheriff's department. And he still didn't ask when detectives Kenny and Espino sat down across from him in an interrogation room. As soon as the door closed behind the detectives, they asked Louis about his relationship with Linnell. And right away, Louis launched into a story about Linnell that, as far as Kenny could tell, was full of lies. Louis said he and Linnell had a great relationship and were deeply in love. He said they'd had a couple of minor fights, but nothing that would lead to a breakup. Just normal relationship stuff. And, he said, neither of them was seeing anyone else. Both Kenny and Espino knew this was false, not just because of the letter they found and the things that Lorraine and Bobby had told them, but because they had checked the police record of calls to Linnell and Louis's home and found that at least twice, officers had been called to break up a domestic disturbance that started because Linnell was speaking to another man. The detectives asked Louis to walk them through everything he did on June 16th, the day Linnell was murdered. Louis admitted that he and Linnell had gotten into a fight that morning because he'd found Linnell's secret cell phone. He also admitted to following Linnell and Lorraine around town, trying to get answers from his girlfriend about why she was using this secret phone. But Louis said they had only fought until about 12:40 p.m. At that point, he said he had gone to LA and gotten his truck repaired by Lorraine's boyfriend. He said he'd gotten to Lorraine's boyfriend's place around 2 p.m. and then spent the rest of the day going to auto supply shops in the area to buy car parts. And then after that, around 6 p.m., he'd arrived at Linnell's mother's house for the night. And while Louis was sitting there telling the detectives this very far-fetched story, all the detectives could think about was the long, thin scratch on the side of Louis's face. When Louis finished his story about what he'd done the day before, Detective Espino asked him about the scratch. And this kicked up a whole nother story by Louis. He talked fast, explaining that Linnell had scratched him a few days ago, but he just said it was a misunderstanding. However, the detectives did not buy it. And so Kenny decided it was time to go on the offensive. He had a folder in front of him, and from it, he took out the letter that police had found at Linnell and Louis's home that said Linnell was breaking up with Louis to go be with her other boyfriend, Ike. And Kenny slid that letter across the table to Louis, and then sat back silently while Louis read it. Now, Kenny was expecting Louis to read this letter with some level of recognition, and then after that, he would likely crumble. After all, Louis had just sat here lying to their faces for a full half hour, and now they were showing him that they had known he was lying to them the whole time. I mean, if nothing else, it was clear they were not in a loving relationship, and his girlfriend was seeing other people. Kenny actually wondered if, when confronted with this letter, if Louis might actually just confess right then and there. But instead, after Louis finished reading it, he just frowned and looked up in confusion and said he had never seen it before. He did admit that he knew who Ike was, but he said that, Linnell and Ike were just friends. Kenny had to stop himself from shaking his head in disgust. These lies were shameless, and he couldn't stand to listen to them anymore. So he leaned across the table, and he told Louis the real reason he had been brought to this interview room. The letter, he said, had been found at his house, and his girlfriend, Linnell, had been murdered. At this, Louis did lose his composure. He started stammering incoherently, and then broke down into hysterical sobs. Detectives Kenny and Espino just watched him for a minute. They didn't feel sorry for him at all. All they actually thought was, this guy is a really good actor. Without waiting for him to stop crying, they told him they were going to need his fingerprints and samples of his DNA. And then they dropped one final bombshell. They said they were going to continue their investigation into Linnell's murder, but Louis was not leaving the sheriff's department. Between the record of domestic disturbances, the scratch on his face, the huge fight the day of the murder, his lies during the interview, and his so far unconfirmed alibi, the detectives told Lewis they had enough to arrest him on suspicion of murder. The detectives left the interrogation room as a crime tech went in to collect Lewis's DNA samples, and a uniformed police officer stood by to start the booking procedure as soon as they were done. The detectives were not even one full day into their investigation, and they already had taken a suspect into custody. And so they were both feeling pretty good and very much like they needed to take a break for at least a few hours and go get some sleep. However, as they walked back into the lobby, they saw a woman with a puffy, tear-streaked face walk in the door, looking lost and bewildered. At the same time, the detectives realized this had to be Bobby Barsock, Linnell's mother, and so sleep would have to wait. They ushered Bobby into a private room and got all three of them cups of coffee. What Kenny and Espino needed from Bobby, first and foremost, was a timeline of the evening of the murder, because Bobby was part of Lewis's alibi. So, as they sipped their coffee, they asked her to walk them through what happened when Lewis showed up, what time, what he said, everything. In a shaky voice, Bobby said Lewis had gotten to her house a little after 6 p.m. She was sure of the time because Family Feud had just started on TV when he walked in the door. Kenny furrowed his eyebrows. This was exactly what Lewis had said, which was a little disappointing because if Lewis had lied about when he got to Bobby's house, it would have made the case simpler. Still, though, this detail didn't mean Lewis was innocent. Linnell had to have been killed sometime between about 12:30 p.m. after she got home from the beauty store and 6:45 p.m. when Lorraine discovered her body. It would have taken Lewis about an hour and a half to drive from Palmdale to Bobby's house, which meant that to arrive by 6, he had to leave no later than about 4:30 p.m. So, Bobby's timeline left Lewis approximately 3 to 4 hours before he had left, when he claimed he was just walking around shopping for car parts, but he actually could have been killing Linnell. But before Detective Kenny could follow that thought any further, Bobby told the detectives that there was something important she had to show them. It was part of the reason she had driven all the way up here. She pulled out her phone, and the detectives leaned forward to look. On the screen, she pulled up a text message. It was from Linnell's other boyfriend, Ike. On the night of the murder, Ike had messaged Bobby to say he spoke to Linnell that day, and she sounded scared. He said he was worried that Lewis was going to hurt her. As Bobby put her phone away, Kenny thought that message made Lewis look really bad. However, Kenny was a veteran homicide detective, and he knew that finding a killer was as much about ruling the right suspect in as it was about ruling the wrong suspects out. The victim's romantic partner was almost always the first suspect, but in this case, Linnell had two of them. Lewis and Ike were both part of this love triangle, so by default, they were both suspects. To prove that Lewis was guilty, the detectives also needed to prove that Ike was innocent. After speaking with Linnell's mother, detectives Kenny and Espino had both been awake for more than 24 hours, so they decided to get some sleep. Then they regrouped on the afternoon of June 17th, the day after the murder. Their case was moving fast. Linnell's boyfriend Lewis was in custody, and they were hoping the evidence would continue to line up and continue to point straight at him. But Linnell was living a more complicated life than it looked like from the outside, and now they needed to rule her second boyfriend, Ike, out as a suspect. So their first step when they returned to the sheriff's department was to track Ike down, and because Bobby had given them his number, it wasn't that difficult. They just called him up on the phone. Ike's full name was Ike Umuna, and he lived in Northern California. And he readily admitted to having a relationship with Linnell, and he said he had given her that secret cell phone because Lewis was unpredictable and scary. When Kenny told Ike that Linnell was dead, Ike broke down. This was exactly what he said he'd been afraid of when he had texted Linnell's mom. Ike said he had an alibi for the entire day of the murder. He said he had been at a job interview at the University of California, Davis, which was a 6-hour drive from Palmdale. And this was exactly the kind of thing Kenny had hoped to hear. Because if this was true, then Kenny knew it was not physically possible for Ike to have killed Linnell himself. That didn't mean he hadn't hired a hitman, but to Kenny, the crime scene looked like a murder committed by an amateur, not a professional. Yes, Linnell had been shot in the back of the head, which was sort of execution style and maybe hitman style, but the bloody, messy scene suggested a level of panic after the fact that didn't make sense for a stranger killing for money. So it was looking very likely that they would be able to rule Ike out as a suspect. Kenny told Ike they would be in touch, and then he hung up the phone. Kenny and Espino looked at each other. They would run down both boyfriends' alibis at the same time, and whoever's didn't check out was very likely their murderer. Now, the breakneck pace of the investigation slowed, as Kenny and Espino began the painstaking work of finding every person that Lewis and Ike mentioned interacting with on the day of the murder. Both detectives were leaning towards Lewis as their guy, and initially, their interviews seemed to confirm their suspicions, ruling Ike out and ruling Lewis in. Ike's alibi was basically airtight. Administrators at the University of California, Davis confirmed that he had been there right in the middle of the day, which meant he definitely was not in Palmdale. And as the detectives talked to more of Linnell's friends, Ike's warning about Lewis's violence started to look less extraordinary. Because basically everyone in Linnell's life seemed to have been worried about her relationship with Lewis. But as the days went by, and Kenny and Espino leaned into tracking each and every one of Lewis's movements on the day of the murder, they found something surprising. Lewis's alibi also checked out. The detectives searched Lewis's truck and found receipts from June 16th, which was the day of the murder. Lewis had claimed he was shopping for car parts that afternoon, but the detectives had not believed him. However, the receipt showed that he was in fact near LA, an hour and a half away from Palmdale, starting a little before 3 p.m. And so suddenly, the window of time that Lewis had to murder Linnell shrunk from around 3 or 4 hours to only about 1 hour. Of course, it was still possible that he killed Linnell in that hour, but when the detectives pulled surveillance footage from the auto shops, they saw Lewis walking calmly through the aisles and paying at the registers. There was no blood, no nervous behavior that would suggest he had just shot and killed his girlfriend. But the final blow to their case against Lewis came when Kenny and Espino tracked down Lorraine's boyfriend, who was the one who actually worked on Lewis's car. He told them that on the day of the murder, Lewis had shown up at his house in LA at 2 p.m. This meant that Lewis had apparently been telling the truth when he said he left his house at 12:40 p.m., which meant Lewis could not have killed Linnell. So, in the middle of July, 1 month after Kenny and Espino had picked up what they thought would be an open and shut murder case, they were forced to release their primary suspect, Lewis, from jail. Now, they were back to square one. Detectives Kenny and Espino could have just waited for the forensic evidence to come back. The crime scene techs had collected so much DNA evidence that it had taken multiple days to process the scene, and would take months to return results. But whoever had killed Linnell had tried and failed to clean it up, and in the process had left fingerprints and maybe even their own DNA behind. But there was something bothering both of the detectives about the timeline they'd spent weeks constructing so methodically. They had a precise chronology of the movements of Linnell, Lorraine, Bobby, Lewis, and Ike, as well as all of Linnell's friends and family, but the only thing this chronology really showed was that no one had been able to kill Linnell. So somebody was lying. They just didn't know who. Now, the detectives had already pulled Linnell's phone records from the day she was killed, but now they decided to get new search warrants. They didn't just want suspect and victim phone records anymore. They wanted to know who their witnesses had spoken to, too. It would take the detectives about 4 months to get their hands on all the records they needed. But when they did, everything suddenly made sense. It turned out that Linnell had been keeping one more secret that Kenny and Espino had not been able to uncover, until they discovered a single phone call made at 4:44 p.m. on the day of the murder that explained everything. Based on evidence collected by investigators, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linnell Barsock on June 16, 2010. That afternoon, sometime before 4 p.m., the killer stood in the living room at Linnell's house, right behind Linnell, staring at the back of her head. Even though they both had moved on from the fight earlier in the day, the killer could tell Linnell was still upset. But truthfully, they weren't really concerned about how Linnell felt. Linnell had so much: a great personality, a loving family, a growing career. But the killer only had Linnell, who they still had deep feelings for. And now that Linnell didn't want them, they decided Linnell shouldn't have anything. Slowly and silently, the killer lifted the gun they had brought with them, aimed it at the back of Linnell's head, and pulled the trigger. Linnell immediately slumped to the floor, and seconds later, blood was pooling all around her. Step 1 of the plan was complete. Now, the killer just had to clean up, and then after that, they would drive to the desert where they would bury her body and everything that had blood on it. They quickly wrapped Linnell's head in a plastic bag to keep more blood from spreading. Then they dragged Linnell to the garage where the car was. After that, the killer sopped up all the blood in the living room with towels, and so far it seemed like everything was going great. Soon the floor was clean. But then, at 4:44 p.m., they heard their phone ring. And on the other end was a person who had some bad news. Somebody was on their way to the house. The killer knew if they didn't hurry, they'd be caught. This made the killer panic, and instead of finishing the cleanup, they decided to make sure that the evidence left behind didn't lead to them, but to somebody else. So they quickly wrote a fake letter and left that behind. Then they ran out of the house, got in their car, and sped off to the sheriff's department to report the crime they had just committed. Because the killer was Linnell's so-called close friend, Lorraine Austin. She executed her friend in cold blood while she was standing right behind her doing her hair. It would turn out these two women were not just friends. They actually had a romantic relationship that they both had kept a secret. They had met online just a month earlier and briefly dated. However, 5 days before her murder, Linnell suggested they just be friends. And Lorraine had been devastated, because not only was she in love with Linnell, she also wanted to be Linnell. Lorraine was extremely jealous of her. Linnell had a career, she had a big house, while Lorraine was in debt and living at her mom's place. And so being dumped by her made her bitter and furious. Lorraine's phone records revealed her romantic relationship with Linnell and their breakup. And most critically, the records also showed what interrupted Lorraine while she was cleaning up the crime scene. It was a phone call from her boyfriend, the same one who had been with Lewis all afternoon fixing his truck. The boyfriend told her that Lewis had just left, and that made Lorraine think Lewis was coming home, when in reality, Lewis was going to Linnell's mother's house for the night. But since Lorraine thought he'd be there soon, she pivoted from cleaning up the crime scene to framing Lewis. When the forensic evidence was finally processed, it revealed Lorraine's DNA and fingerprints at the scene, but that was to be expected because she was friends with Linnell. However, her DNA and fingerprints were found in areas that tied her directly to the crime. By the time police solved the case, Lorraine had gone on the run. She wasn't captured until a year and a half after the murder, after authorities put the case on America's Most Wanted, and a tipster spotted her in Belize. Lorraine Austin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive 25 years to life prison terms. She'll be eligible for parole in 2032. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. 911 dispatchers hear a lot of interesting stories coming from the other end of the phone. But one group of dispatchers out of Reno, Nevada may win the award for the creepiest 911 calls ever received. When the details of these calls they got were put online, the internet went crazy. Here is their story. There was this old couple that lived about 20 miles east of Reno, Nevada. In 2010, the husband dies, leaving the wife all alone in this house. Shortly after his passing, she began calling 911 2-3 times a week, requesting things like, "Can you please put some water on to boil? Hey, can you change the thermostat?" It was clear she was showing signs of dementia, and the dispatchers were respectful of her and gently told her that this is 911, you can only call if it's an emergency, and at some point the woman would understand her mistake and she would say sorry and she would hang up. No first responders were ever sent out for these calls because it didn't seem like an emergency, it just seemed like a confused elderly person. But no matter how many times they told her, she kept calling back, and eventually her calls took a turn. Instead of calling 911 to ask for help with mundane tasks around the house, she would call 911 believing she was talking directly to her deceased husband, John. The dispatcher would pick up and the woman would say, "John, where are you? John, John." By this time, the dispatchers had gotten so many calls from this woman, they would recognize her address coming through, and they knew what to expect. They would answer the phone, they'd be respectful, and they would tell her, like they always did, "This is 911, you can't call here, you need to talk to your family." And again, they did not send a responding unit out to her because it just seemed like she was confused, not in any danger. But one day when she called, she sounded frantic and scared. "John, please come home, help me, I need help, John, come home." This time, they would send first responders out to the woman's house. When the responding unit arrives at her house just minutes after she had placed the 911 call, they go to the door and they're knocking and they're yelling for her, and she's not coming to the door, and it's all quiet in the house. The door is unlocked, so they open it up and they announce themselves. They walk inside and immediately they can tell the heat is not on because it's very, very cold inside the house. They look around the first floor and they can't find her, and there's no sign of a struggle or any obvious problems that could have happened inside of the house. So they go upstairs and they start searching all the rooms and no one's there until they get to the last room, and it's the bedroom. They go inside and there's an older woman who's lying on the bed, and she's clearly deceased and has been for several hours because rigor mortis had already set in. The police are able to confirm that the woman who's lying on the bed is the same woman who owns the house and lives there. And at this point, they call back to dispatch and they tell them, hey, the woman that you claim made this 911 call, well, it can't have been her. Because based on rigor mortis, she was dead at the time that 911 call was made. But the dispatchers are like, no way. We know what she sounds like. We speak to her multiple times a week. We have a whole protocol built when we see her address come across because we speak to her so often. That 911 call that you got that led you to that house where she was, that call was made by her. What they ultimately decide is the reason for this discrepancy is she didn't have rigor mortis. She was just stiff because it was really cold inside of her house, and that she had died in those couple of minutes between leaving the 911 call and when officers arrived. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're a little freaked out. A few days go by and another call is placed to 911 coming from that woman's home address. The dispatcher sees that and has to do a double take, like that's not possible. But they're thinking, okay, this could be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be anything. Picks up the phone and she's shocked when it's the same woman who is frantically yelling for John to come here, save me, help me, I need help. And the dispatcher, who's well aware of the history and well aware that this woman's supposed to be dead, stays calm, goes through the procedure, tries to get more information from this woman, but the call ends abruptly and there's no more information to be had. And so not knowing what else to do, she asks a responding unit to go check this house out. The responding unit goes over to the property, they knock on the door, no one's inside, the door is actually still open, they go in, the house is empty, there's no one there, there's no one that could have made that call. At this point, dispatch is like, okay, this has got to be a prank. But the next day, same thing happens. Here comes a call from the dead woman's house. They pick it up and it's this distraught woman yelling for help, I need my husband. And the dispatcher is trying to get more information, but they can't. And then the line cuts out. Once again, they have to send responders to this location because this woman has called 911 and is saying that she needs help. And once again, the officers get to the house and it's vacant. Just like when she was alive, these calls would persist multiple times a week. They continued even after her house was broken into and burned to the ground. There's not even a house anymore, and there are still calls coming through from that address to 911. Finally, the police get in touch with the phone company and they explain the situation, and the phone company looks at their records and they say, actually, her phone line was disconnected almost immediately after she was deceased. But they tell police there's a chance that it might not have been disconnected properly at the site, and that could be a reason why it's still working. So they send a lineman to go check out the actual property to confirm her lines were disconnected properly and that no wires were getting crossed, and he said all of it checked out. Everything has been detached this whole time. The phone company thought perhaps there was a digital recording of her that got trapped in their system and was randomly bouncing to their call center. But the dispatchers would say, it doesn't sound like a recording that's playing the same every single time. It's always the same message. She's yelling for her husband to come save her. But the way she sounds is always different. It's a unique phone call every single time. So because there wasn't a definitive explanation for why this was happening, they had to treat each call like it was serious. And so multiple times a week for a year, they received these ghost calls and had to send out responding officers to check on her. Even though the house was gone and there was nothing there and there was never anyone there. It was just a vacant lot. And then finally, a year after this woman has died, the calls just abruptly stopped. And the police did not launch an investigation into what it was, because the reality is police need to prioritize things that are threats to people or places. And this really wasn't either of those things. It was just really bizarre. And so the official explanation for how a dead woman could be calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent house for a year is, we don't know. Our next and final story is called The Capitol Theater Haunting. In 2006, Dave Murphy had just become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first role was as a protective service officer, which meant he'd be in charge of physical security in a number of the county facilities. Dave's first facility was the Capitol City Theater, which is a landmark inside of Salt Lake City. It's been around since the early 1900s. It's this beautiful, grand theater. So in early August, Dave reports to the Capitol City Theater for his first day on the job, and he meets his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. He gets there on this first day, and right away, Dave would say that Morgan was just strictly business. The first place that Morgan takes Dave is the control room, which sits on the first floor of the theater. The theater had 3 floors, and then it also had a basement as well. So the control room was on that first floor. Inside of the control room were all of these security monitors, because there was all these cameras set up inside of the theater. The cameras weren't great though. You pretty much could only tell what was in frame if there was a light on, and most of the time at night especially, lights were off. Once they were done looking at the control room, Morgan says to Dave, now we're going to go do our rounds. This is something we do every time you get to the theater. You do a security round and make sure everything's locked, all the lights are off. Before you come back to the control room, you'll do that at the beginning of your shift and at the end of your shift. Morgan brings Dave downstairs, and it's the first time Dave is seeing the basement, and he's shocked by how big it is. It is this massive hallway that stretches way down. In the middle of the hall is a piano that's just sitting out in the middle, and the lighting's not good down there. This is a very old theater. Everything in the building was pretty old. And Dave remembers thinking that he was immediately creeped out by this scene, this long hallway with all these doors and this piano right in the middle of the hallway. And he's thinking to himself, I don't want to spend much time down here. This is so creepy. But they go down the hall, they check all the doors, they make their way up to the main floor, the second floor, the third floor, everything gets checked. And so after they do this security round, Dave and Morgan go back to the control room, and Dave is anticipating getting to know Morgan a little bit. This is their first night. They're going to be working together a lot. And Dave would say that Morgan just seemed really cold and just did not want to talk to Dave very much. And as soon as their shift was almost over, Morgan was very eager to just knock out the security rounds and just get out of that building. At the end of that night, Dave remembers thinking that there's just something off about Morgan's behavior. It seemed like Morgan really didn't like being in the theater. And it would turn out that he was onto something, because Morgan didn't like being in that building. But it would take him a while to share with Dave why. Over the next couple of days, Morgan and Dave would do their security rounds together, because Dave's in training, Morgan's teaching him. But on August 9th, which is 2 days after Dave's first day on the job, Morgan was confident that Dave knew how to secure the whole building. And so at the end of the night, he tells Dave, why don't you do the security rounds yourself? Dave feels very confident that he knows how to do it. He goes down into the basement, makes sure all the doors are shut and locked, that the lights are off, finishes the basement, goes up to the first floor where the control room is and checks all the rooms on that floor. He goes into the main auditorium space. He's checking all the different nooks and crannies to make sure there's nobody hiding in there. He goes up to the second floor. He checks all the different rooms up there and the balcony, makes his way up to the third floor where there's all the offices of staff that work at the theater. At the end of the search, the last room he would check was the rehearsal room. And it was the only room where there was no door to it. So you'd poke your head in, kind of look around, make sure no one was in there, and then you would leave, and that's the end of your check. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room, he flips the light on, and he looks inside, doesn't see anybody, is satisfied that no one's in there, turns the light off, and as he's about to turn back into the hallway, he hears a door slam with tremendous force right across the hallway from where he was, and it was the bathroom door. And his first reaction is someone just ran out of the bathroom. Someone who had snuck into the building must have run out of the bathroom, and they're making a break for it to get out of the theater before I catch them. And so he instinctively picks up his radio and he calls to Morgan and says, someone's on the third floor. But when Morgan looks at the camera, he doesn't see anybody. At this point, Dave's drawn his weapon, and he's looking down the hall. He doesn't see anybody. And as he's waiting for Morgan to come upstairs to back him up so they can go look for this person that's just ran down the hall, he realizes 2 things. One, just because he heard the door slam doesn't mean they left and slammed it. They could be in the bathroom. And so he's thinking to himself, someone could be in the bathroom right now. Maybe that's why we didn't see him on the camera. And then the second thing he thought of is that door, the bathroom door, can't slam. It's got this huge hydraulic hinge to it. It can't slam. So his gun is drawn and he's aiming it at the bathroom door right as Morgan comes up on his right. Morgan draws his pistol, he's got it on the door as well, and they make entry into the bathroom. They clear all the different spaces in the bathroom, and no one's in there, and there's no way to get out of there. Morgan and Dave are like, okay, well, they must not have come in here. They must have run out of the bathroom. They're somewhere in the theater. And so they decide they're going to search the entire building and find this person that clearly was just in the bathroom, and that's how they slammed the door. We're not going to worry about how they slammed the door with the hydraulic hinge. We just know it was slammed somehow. So they leave the bathroom, guns still drawn, and they start making their way down the hall. They're checking all the doors, everything is locked. When they start making their way downstairs to the second floor, Dave recognizes through the door, because there's a door leading onto the second floor, he can see that the lights are on, and he had turned them off. And so as they're walking down the stairs, he says to Morgan, hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor? And Morgan's like, no. And so they think that whoever was here, whoever was in the bathroom is on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They go into the second floor, and not only are the lights on, but all the doors on the second floor had been opened. They search the entire second floor. They search every single room. No one's on the second floor. They turn off the lights. They shut all the doors. Everything's locked. When they went down to the first floor, everything was the way it should have been. Locked, lights off, nothing down there. And they go down to the basement. And even though it was creepy being down there because they've now searched the whole building and they're anticipating coming in contact with whoever is here, assuming they haven't left the building yet. And there's no one down there. They decided to review the footage from the third floor to see if they could pick up someone running in the hall around the time that door slammed. But the camera was not trained on the bathroom door. So you just have this view down the hall. You can't see the bathroom specifically, not to mention the hallway is dark and the cameras are terrible without light. And so all they're able to see is the light go on in the rehearsal room while Dave is doing his last check in there. The lights turn off because Dave's about to turn around. And then after that, you just hear this massive slam of this door, but you can't see what happened. So they don't know what to make of it. They're both very much on edge that someone might still be in the building. And so they do another sweep of the building and no one's there. And so they decide to just chalk it up and say, we were hearing things and seeing things. I'm sure it's fine. Let's just get out of here. And they leave. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan is working alone. Dave wasn't coming in that day, so Morgan's alone in the theater doing a shift. And at some point in the night, as he's sitting in the control room, he thinks he hears whispering in the hall right behind him. And so after the experience he had with Dave a couple nights ago, he's on edge. So he draws his pistol right away. And so he goes out into the hallway, and immediately when he steps into the hall, the whispering seems to go farther and farther away from him down the hall. So he gets out there, he's looking around, he can't see anything. He makes his way down the hallway towards the stairs that go down into the basement, or if he wanted to go up to the second floor. And when he gets to the top of the stairwell, he's, gun drawn, looking down, looking up. He hears what sounds like coughing coming from the basement. And at this point, Morgan said that he was actually pretty scared. I mean, imagine being alone in this theater. Just a couple of days earlier, you've had this weird experience with slamming doors and doors being opened and lights going on that somebody else, another police officer, witnessed with you. You're alone in this theater and you're hearing coughing coming from the basement after hearing voices behind you. That's pretty terrifying. So he very slowly starts going down the stairwell. He's getting ready to clear the corner, and just as he does, the coughing stops. He turns the lights on and he looks down the hall and there's nothing there. He starts making his way down the hall. He's checking every door, making sure it's locked, making sure that everything is secure. And he gets all the way down the hall. And as he's almost done checking the basement, he smells smoke, and it's coming from a door right next to him. And so he unlocks that door and he goes in, and there's no fire. But all he can smell is smoke. So he turns the light on. He's looking around. There's no fire. He's convinced that somewhere down in the basement there's a fire. He goes to every single room and he keeps checking, and there's nothing. And then at some point the smoke smell dissipates. He checks every space in the theater to look for a fire, and there's no fire. He's wondering if he should call the fire department, but he's thinking, what would I tell them? There's no fire. And so he ultimately, after checking 3-4 times and being very confident there wasn't a fire, he just says, okay, no fire. I guess I was just smelling things. A few weeks later, on September 4th, Dave has just arrived at the theater. He's there a little bit early. Their shift started at 5 p.m. He was there at about 4:30. And when he walked into the building, he sees that there are 3 staff members sitting at the front desk talking to each other. And as he walks past, one of them is talking about ghosts inside of the theater. And it immediately piques his interest. And so he walked over to the guy talking about ghosts and he introduced himself. And it turned out that this guy was a man named Blair Fuller, who was a senior accountant at the theater. And so Dave asked Blair, what are you talking about with ghosts in the theater?
because I provide physical security here and I've seen some strange things here. I'd just love to hear what you have to say about it. So they head up to the 3rd floor where Blair's office was, and they sit down, and Blair says, okay, I got a doozy for you. This happened to me a couple years ago. I was actually in this office. It was about 10 o'clock at night. I was doing some work, and I heard the elevator kick on. Now, the elevator was right outside of his office, and anytime it was on, the engine was really loud. It was really obvious if the elevator was moving around. And so he's doing his accounting work and he hears that engine kick on. He doesn't think much of it, but then it clicks that he's the only one in the building. And so he kind of looks out the glass window of his office. He had a closed door office with 2 windows looking out into the foyer where there's this elevator. And he looks out and he can see that the little lights above the elevator showing what floor it's on have lit up and it's going up. So the elevator was in the basement and now it's in the 1st floor, the 2nd floor, 3rd floor. The door's open and there's no one there. And at this point, Blair says that he wasn't concerned. He figured, okay, maybe there's some maintenance, maybe it's scheduled to do that, who knows? But after a little while, the alarm goes off in the elevator to signify that something is obstructing the door from shutting. And he's like, there's nothing obstructing the door, why isn't it shutting? And so he leaves his office and he kind of walks over to the elevator and he walks into the elevator. And he said immediately he felt this massive drop in temperature inside of the elevator. And as he's standing there, he turns around. Now he's looking back towards his office inside of the elevator. The doors start to shut. And for whatever reason, he said, I didn't get off. I just decided I'm going to ride this elevator. The basement button lights up as if someone had pressed basement and they start going down. And he's sitting there thinking, what in the world is going on? It was just on an alarm because the door wasn't shutting. And then miraculously, when I go inside of it, it suddenly works again and it's going to the basement. So he goes to the basement, the door opens, no one there. He steps out and Blair says that it took all of his courage to yell out, hey, is anyone down here? And as soon as he did and he didn't hear a response, he said he didn't want to make any more sound. The elevator sat in the middle of the hall in the basement. It's that huge hall with that piano sitting right in the middle. The lights are off. And he pokes his head down one way. There's nothing down there. He sees the piano barely from the light of the elevator. And he looks down the other way. There's no one there. And at this point, he's just so spooked. He just gets back in the elevator and he hits floor 3, floor 3, floor 3. And he's hitting like door closed, door closed, door closed. The door closes and he goes back up to his office. He goes into his office and he shuts the door and he sits down and he's thinking like, what was that? Why did that just happen? I got to find out if they're running maintenance or something. And as he's sitting in his chair thinking about this strange experience, he hears what sounds like banging sounds coming from outside of his office in that foyer near the elevator. He just goes to his door and he opens it up and he pokes his head into the foyer and he looks to the side and there's this big filing cabinet and all of the cabinets are out. They've all been pulled out. He certainly didn't do this. And it was as if someone was one by one pushing each of them shut, these big heavy cabinets. And he's watching as one by one these things are slamming shut. One by one until the whole thing is shut. And so he goes over and he's like trying to disprove what he just saw, that he can open up a drawer and that it will shut on its own. But none of them shut on their own. You have to shut it. Something has to shut it for it to shut. And so he packed up for the day and left and did not work another night shift at the theater. Later that night, Dave would share Blair's story with Morgan. He wasn't really sure how Morgan was going to react, but Morgan actually would open up and he would say, you know, before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched when I was here. And then we had that experience, obviously, where the lights are coming on and you heard that banging from that bathroom door. And then just a few days ago, I heard voices coming from the hall and I heard someone coughing in the basement and I smelled smoke and there was no one there. And so they start going back and forth, exchanging stories of just how uncomfortable this place made them feel. And so they're wondering what they should do about this. And Dave has this idea. He's like, my best friend, I'll invite him to come over here one night and we'll tell him that we're giving him a tour of the building and we'll just see what he says. We'll see if he reacts to anything here. Who knows? You know, maybe something strange will happen and then we'll have another person validate it. Morgan thinks that's a good idea. And so Dave reaches out to his best friend, Greg. Greg would say that he was a little bit surprised to be getting this offer to come take a tour of the theater, but he was interested, and since Dave was asking, he figured he would oblige him, and so Greg agrees to come to the theater and take a tour. So the next day, Dave and Morgan are at the theater, and Greg shows up, and so they start this tour, they go in the main auditorium, they're looking around, and then they make their way into the basement. Morgan turns on the light. And Morgan and Dave instantly see a little ways down the hall on the left, one of the doors has been opened. And so Dave and Morgan push Greg out of the way. They draw their pistols and they're aimed at the open door. And so Greg just stays behind them as Morgan and Dave make their way down to this open door. And when they get right outside the door and they're about to push it open to go inside, the door slams shut right in front of Greg and Dave and Morgan. And they all are looking at each other like, what's going on? But before they can do anything, the door handle starts rattling really aggressively. After the rattling stops, Dave and Morgan look at each other and they nod their head like, we got to go in there. Greg is scared about being out in the hall alone, and so he just follows them in. And so the three of them go into this room. Dave and Morgan are, pistols drawn. It's a small room. There's no one in there. Light switch on, no one in there. Greg suddenly gasps and he points to the corner and he says, someone's sitting in the corner. And Dave and Morgan immediately train their guns on what's in the corner, but no one's there. And Greg's like, I just saw someone sitting in the corner. It looked like he had a hood on, he had like a sweatshirt on, I don't know, but he was right there. And so Dave and Morgan, they're freaked out because they brought Greg here on some level to disprove the strangeness. And now the three of them have seen a door slam that shouldn't have been open in the first place. Greg's claiming to have seen a figure sitting in the corner. This scared the crap out of all three of them. They quickly left, locked, shut off the lights, went upstairs. Greg's like, I'm out of here. Greg leaves. And Dave and Morgan are like, now what? So at this point, all the strangeness that was happening in the theater was getting reported, but it was being reported in a way that Dave and Morgan didn't seem like they were referencing something haunted, but rather someone was breaking in. Ultimately, the county installed new cameras inside of the theater. These updated cameras had infrared technology, which allowed them to see better when the lights were off. They were hoping that this would allow them to catch whoever was breaking in practically every time Dave and Morgan are on shift. So on the day that it was installed, September 15th, Morgan is working there alone. And he's sitting in the control room looking at the different cameras, and he's kind of playing around with the different screens and seeing what each of the cameras can do. And at some point, something catches his eye in one of the screens. In the main auditorium, it appeared like someone might be sitting in one of the seats, but the camera was zoomed back enough that he couldn't get a clear picture, and he didn't know what was normal in any of these cameras, because this is the first time he's looking at any of these screens. And so he's looking at the camera really closely, and he thinks he sees someone, he can't really tell, that has a hood on or a shroud on that's just sitting in the middle of the theater. And he can see clear as day a set of eyes. And before Morgan has a chance to do it, it just starts raising into the ceiling and disappears. Morgan didn't even check to see what it was. He was done. He literally quit that day. That was his last day at the theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan has quit and Dave is working alone at the theater, he's in the control room, and all of a sudden he hears a piano playing. And there's only one piano in the entire theater, and it's sitting in the basement. It's his job to protect this place, so he knows he has to go down and check because it could be some hooligan in the building somewhere. So he leaves the control room, and as he starts walking over to the stairs with his gun drawn, the music is getting louder and louder, the piano is getting louder and louder and louder. He makes his way down the steps, and as he's about to turn the corner, he hears the guard that protects the keys on the piano slam shut, and the piano stops. Then he turns around the corner and he looks, and there's no one down there. He flips on the light, no one's in the hall. He knows he's not going to find anyone down here. It's this entity that's causing all this mayhem inside of the theater. Dave's seen enough. He's done. He's done with this theater, and he goes right back upstairs. He goes in the control room, locks it, stays there till the end of his shift, and then he is out. And the next day, he goes to his sergeant and he says, you can't ever put me back inside that theater or I will quit. And so sure enough, he was transferred. Over the next 2 months, they didn't have anyone who could do full-time security at the theater. So different random officers would be there for a couple hours, a couple of days a week, until November 26th. They found another officer, a veteran police officer named Josh Thomas, who was going to be working at the theater full-time. On November 26th, the first night that Josh Thomas was going to be there, he didn't have anyone to turn over with, so he was just alone at the theater. And it just so happens that Dave is in a patrol car near the theater. And when at some point in the night, Josh comes over the radio and says, hey, I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater. Dave knows that it's probably not someone breaking in. He knows what's going on inside that theater. He was the closest to it. And even though he did not want to go, he felt like it was his responsibility to go to that theater and be Josh's backup. And if it was what Dave thought it would be, this entity in the theater, that he would be able to explain to him what he had seen before he ultimately decided never to go back. And when Dave gets to the theater, there's this back door that they would go into, and he sees Josh is standing just outside the theater. And Dave would say that Josh's eyes were, like saucers. He looked terrified. And so Dave has an inkling of what's going on, and he goes over to Josh and he's like, what's going on? Is someone still in there? He said that he had been doing security rounds and he had heard what sounded like voices when he was in the basement, and he didn't think much of it. He checked all the rooms, everything was shut. And when he made his way up to the third floor, he saw that the elevator had kicked on. It was in the basement, and suddenly the light was on and it was roaring up to the third floor. And when the elevator opened up, there was no one there. And he's standing there looking at it, and he looks inside, there's no one there, and then the alarm goes off. That's when he called in for backup. Dave says, look, let's just go search the building, we'll do it together. They clear the whole theater, no one's there. And before Dave leaves, they go into the main auditorium where the stage is, and they're just standing on the stage chatting with each other. And Dave, his back is to where the audience would be. And Josh is facing Dave, facing towards the seats. Josh just suddenly stopped. Mid-sentence, he's just frozen and looking just beyond Dave's shoulder. And Dave goes, what? And Josh goes, there's something behind you. Dave slowly turns around, and as soon as he does, he can tell immediately what Josh is looking at. Standing in the very back of the theater away from them is a man standing in the corner with its hands by its sides. Its back is to them, and it's looking down with a hood over its head. Dave turns his whole body around to look at this thing right as this thing turns around real quick and looks directly at them. It has these deep, dark, sunken eyes, and its face looks like it had been very badly burned, like it was black and charred. And it's looking at them before it just turns and runs out the back of the theater. Josh believed that that was an intruder. Dave was fairly certain that that was just another example of this entity that haunts the theater. But they would search the building and they could never find that cloaked figure again. And that was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room and he filled him in on why Morgan had quit and why he ultimately had quit. And he also told him the story from Blair. So Josh is like, great, I'm glad I work here now. This was the last time that Dave would go to the theater. But Dave would do some additional digging on the history of the theater. It would turn out that in the 40s, there was this horrible fire, and a man had been trapped in the basement when the fire had erupted, and he had died inside of the theater. And so Dave would share this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them all believed that what they were witnessing was the ghost of that man who died in that fire. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please put the Amazon Music follow button's feet in cement and throw them in the ocean. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen's. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen's Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites